The snow fell in thick, silent curtains across the Carpathian foothills, blanketing the world in a purity that felt almost sacred. Elena Cartwright stood at the frost-edged window of her stone cottage, watching the last light of day surrender to the encroaching darkness. The sun had set early, as it always did in December, leaving behind only a thin ribbon of crimson along the horizon that bled into the gathering night, like a wound that refused to heal. She pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the chill she felt had little to do with the temperature. It had been 3 years since Thomas had died, 3 years since the fever had taken him and left her alone in this isolated corner of the world. The villagers in the valley below had urged her to return to England, to seek the comfort of family and familiar streets, but Elena had refused. This cottage, perched on the edge of the forest with its view of the distant mountains, had been their dream. Leaving it would mean abandoning the last tangible connection to the man she had loved. The wind howled against the shutters, carrying with it the scent of pine and something else, something ancient and unknowable that seemed to emanate from the dark forests that surrounded her property. The locals spoke of these woods in hushed tones, crossing themselves when forced to pass near the tree line after dusk. They whispered of creatures that walked upright, but were not men, of wolves that were more than wolves, of a castle deep in the mountains where no mortal should venture. Elena had dismissed such tales as peasant superstition, the fearful imaginings of simple people trying to explain the natural mysteries of an untamed wilderness. But on nights like this, when the darkness pressed close and the wind seemed to carry voices in languages she could not understand, she found herself wondering if there might be more truth to the old stories than she cared to admit. She turned from the window and surveyed her modest home with a critical eye. The fire in the hearth crackled warmly, casting dancing shadows across the rough wooden beams of the ceiling. The table was set for one, as it had been for 1,000 solitary meals since Thomas's death. A pot of stew simmered over the fire, filling the room with the rich aroma of herbs and vegetables. It was too much food for one person, but she had never learned to cook in smaller portions. Some habits, born of happier times, were difficult to break. The clock on the mantel chimed 7 times, its sound oddly muffled by the heavy snow that continued to fall outside. Eleanor ladled some of the stew into a bowl and carried it to the table, but before she could sit, a sound stopped her. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but it grew steadily louder. Footsteps. Someone was approaching the cottage through the storm. Her heart quickened. Visitors were rare at any time, but in weather like this, they were unheard of. The nearest village was 5 miles down the mountain road, and no one would venture out in such conditions without desperate cause. She set down the bowl and moved to the door, pressing her ear against the thick wood. The footsteps had stopped just outside. Then came the knock. 3 measured raps, neither urgent nor timid, but somehow conveying both courtesy and expectation. Eleanor hesitated, her hand hovering over the iron latch. Every instinct screamed caution. She was alone, isolated, vulnerable. Opening the door to a stranger in the dead of night was the height of foolishness. But another part of her, the part that had chosen compassion over fear throughout her life, could not ignore the fact that someone was out there in the killing cold. She thought of Thomas, who had never turned away a soul in need, who had believed that humanity's salvation lay in small acts of kindness offered without calculation or reward. What would he do? Eleanor lifted the latch and pulled the door open. The man who stood on her threshold seemed to have stepped out of another century. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with a bearing that spoke of aristocratic breeding and absolute self-possession. His clothing, though travel-worn, was of obvious quality. A long black cloak lined with crimson silk hung from his broad shoulders, dusted with snow that had not yet melted. Beneath it, she glimpsed a tailored coat and waistcoat of a style she associated with the previous century, immaculately maintained despite the obvious rigors of his journey. But it was his face that held her attention. He appeared to be in his middle years, perhaps 40, though something about him suggested both youth and impossible age. His features were aristocratic and refined, with high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and a prominent nose that gave him an almost predatory profile. His hair, black as a raven's wing and shot through with distinguished streaks of silver, was swept back from a high forehead. His skin was pale, though whether from the cold or by nature she could not tell. Yet it was his eyes that truly arrested her. They were dark, so dark they seemed almost black in the dim light spilling from her doorway, and they held within them a depth of sorrow and experience that no mortal of 40 years should possess. When those eyes met hers, Elena felt a strange sensation, as though she were falling into vast and ancient depths where secrets too terrible for daylight lay waiting. For a long moment, neither spoke. The stranger simply stood there, snow gathering on his shoulders, studying her with an intensity that should have been frightening but somehow was not. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and cultured, carrying the trace of an accent she could not quite place, something Eastern European but refined by education and centuries of use. "Forgive the intrusion, madam. I find myself caught in this storm far from my intended destination. I saw your light and dared to hope for shelter until the weather clears." He paused and something flickered across his features, an expression that might have been regret or perhaps self-mockery. "Though I understand if you prefer not to admit a stranger at such an hour. These are wild lands, and caution is wisdom." His formality was disarming, as was his acknowledgement of her right to refuse. Elena found herself searching his face for signs of threat or deception, but found only a profound weariness and something else, a loneliness so deep and ancient it called to her own isolation like a melody seeking harmony. "You will freeze to death out here," she heard herself say. "Please come in." Something passed through his eyes at her words, an emotion too complex to name. He inclined his head in a gesture of old-world courtesy and stepped across the threshold. As he entered, Elena noticed that despite having walked through deep snow, his boots made no wet prints on her floor. She told herself it must be a trick of the firelight, even as a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that something was not quite right. The stranger removed his cloak with practiced grace, revealing the full extent of his unusual attire. Everything about him spoke of quality and care, yet the styles were decades out of fashion, as though he had stepped out of her grandmother's time and into her own. He folded the cloak carefully and held it, clearly uncertain where to place it. "Please, allow me," Elena said, taking the garment from him. The fabric was of extraordinary quality, heavy silk that seemed to drink in the light. As her fingers brushed his in the exchange, she felt a shock of cold so intense it was almost painful. His hands were like ice, bloodless and rigid. She quickly hung the cloak by the door and turned back to find him standing perfectly still in the center of the room, his dark eyes taking in every detail of her modest home. "You have a lovely cottage," he said softly. "It speaks of care and remembrance, a place where love once dwelt and has left its mark upon the very stones." The observation was so unexpected and so accurate that Elena felt tears prick her eyes. "My husband and I restored it together. He died 3 years ago. I am sorry for your loss." The stranger's voice carried genuine sympathy, weighted with a grief that suggested he understood such loss intimately. To lose one's companion is to lose a part of oneself. The world becomes a colder, darker place. "Yes," Elena whispered. "Yes, exactly that." They stood in silence for a moment, united in their understanding of loneliness. Then Elena shook herself, remembering her duties as a hostess. "You must be frozen through. Please sit by the fire. I was just about to have dinner. There is more than enough for two." The stranger's expression became unreadable. "You are kind to offer, but I would not wish to impose further. Shelter from the storm is charity enough." "Nonsense. I will not have a guest go hungry under my roof." Elena moved to the table and began setting out a second place. "Besides, the stew will only go to waste otherwise. I always cook too much, an old habit from happier times." She felt his eyes on her as she worked, a weight of attention so focused it was almost physical. When she glanced back at him, he had not moved from his position near the fire. The flames cast strange shadows across his features, making his face seem to shift between youth and age, humanity and something other. "Please," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her own. "Sit." After a moment's hesitation, he moved to the table with a grace that was almost feline. He lowered himself into the chair with the careful precision of someone accustomed to controlling every movement, every gesture. Elena served the stew, ladling generous portions into both bowls, and set a loaf of bread between them along with butter and a carafe of wine. "I am Elena Cartwright," she said. seating herself across from him. "And you are?" The stranger regarded the food before him with an expression she could not quite read. "You may call me Dracula. I am a traveler, far from home and seeking something I fear I lost long ago." The name struck her as unusual but not impossible. She had learned during her time in this region that the local nobility bore strange and ancient titles. "Are you from nearby, Count Dracula? Your accent suggests you are not English, yet you speak my language flawlessly." "I have walked many roads and learned many tongues," and he replied, his eyes still fixed on the bowl before him. "As for my home, it lies deeper in these mountains, in a place where few mortals venture willingly. I have not used that title in many years, but your courtesy in offering it touches me more than you might imagine." Elena picked up her spoon and began to eat, but she noticed that her guest made no move to touch his food. He simply sat there, his pale hands resting on either side of the bowl, staring at the steam that rose from it as though it held answers to questions he dared not ask. "Is something wrong with the stew?" she asked, concern coloring her voice. "I know it is simple fare, but it is wholesome and hot." Dracula raised his eyes to hers, and in that moment, Elena saw something in their depths that made her breath catch. Pain, ancient and absolute. Hunger, carefully controlled but never satisfied. And beneath it all, a longing so profound it seemed to encompass centuries of denial and loss. "There is nothing wrong with your kindness," he said quietly, "but I must confess, I cannot partake of mortal food. My constitution is such that only one sustenance can nourish me, and it is not one that civilized company should discuss over dinner." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Elena's rational mind told her to be afraid, to demand that he leave, to bar the door behind him and pray for morning. But something deeper, some instinct that went beyond logic, kept her seated. She set down her spoon and looked at him directly. "Then why did you accept my invitation to dine?" A smile touched his lips, sad and self-aware. "Because it has been longer than you can imagine since anyone has offered me such simple kindness. Because your compassion, freely given to a stranger in the night, is a gift more precious than any feast. Because I am weary, madam, so very weary of the darkness and the cold and the eternal hunger that drives me. For one evening, I wish to sit in a warm place with another soul, and pretend, however briefly, that I am still a man and not the monster I have become." The confession was so raw, so utterly without pretense, that Elena found herself leaning forward. "What are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dracula held her gaze, and slowly, deliberately, he smiled. His lips parted, and in the firelight, Elena saw what she had missed before. His canine teeth were not those of a normal man. They were elongated, sharp as daggers, designed by nature or curse to pierce flesh and drain the vital essence from living things. Fangs. The room seemed to tilt around her. Every folk tale, every whispered warning from the villagers, every superstition she had dismissed as ignorance, came crashing back with the force of revelation. She was sitting across from the undead, from a vampire, from a creature that should not exist, but whose reality she could no longer deny. She should scream. She should run. She should do anything but what she did, which was to remain perfectly still and continue to meet those ancient, sorrowful eyes. "You are Count Dracula," she said slowly, testing the name in a new context. "Not just a count, the Count Dracula, the one from the legends." He inclined his head in acknowledgement. "I am he, Prince of Wallachia in life, Prince of darkness in death. I have walked this earth for more than 4 centuries, sustained by blood and cursed with eternal night. I have killed countless mortals, and damned those I loved most dearly. I am everything your grandmother warned you about in bedtime tales, meant to keep children from wandering after dark." "Yet you knocked on my door," Elena heard herself say. "You asked for permission to enter. You have not harmed me or threatened me. Why?" Dracula leaned back in his chair, a gesture of such weariness it seemed to encompass centuries. "Because I am tired of being what I am. Because your light called to something in me I thought long dead. Because when you opened your door and looked at me with concern for a stranger's welfare rather than fear or hatred, I remembered what it felt like to be a man, who could still receive kindness without suspicion of his nature. He paused, his gaze drifting to the fire. I should not have come here. I endanger you simply by my presence, but I am weak tonight, not in body, but in spirit. The weight of eternity presses heavily upon me, and I sought respite in the one thing I can no longer claim, the simple warmth of human connection. Elena's mind raced. Everything she knew about vampires from folklore screamed that she was in mortal danger. Yet the creature before her, despite his fearsome nature, seemed less a threat than a deeply wounded soul seeking something she could barely comprehend. She thought of Thomas, of his belief in redemption and the possibility of grace even for the fallen. "What is it like?" she asked quietly, "to be what you are?" Dracula's eyes snapped back to hers, surprise evident in his features. "You wish to know. You do not scream or beg for your life. Would either do any good?" A sound escaped him that might have been a laugh or a sob. "No. If I meant you harm, you would already be dead or worse. But I came here seeking only shelter from the storm, not sustenance. Your blood, though it sings to me like siren song, will remain yours unless you freely offer it, which I pray you never do." "Then tell me," Elena insisted, "tell me what it is to be immortal and alone." And so he did. As the fire burned low and the snow continued to fall outside, Count Dracula spoke of his existence in a voice that carried the weight of centuries. He told her of the endless nights, of watching everyone he had ever known crumble to dust while he remained unchanging. He spoke of the hunger, constant and consuming, that reduced all higher thought to the desperate need for blood. He described the isolation of being feared and hunted, unable to form genuine connections with mortals who would inevitably age and die while he continued on forever. Elena listened without interruption, her food forgotten, as this prince of darkness laid bare the hell of his existence. She heard in his words not the boasting of a predator, but the confession of a man trapped in a nightmare from which he could not wake. When he spoke of the people he had loved and destroyed, his voice broke with genuine anguish. When he described the moment his mortality ended and his curse began, she saw tears glisten in his ancient eyes. "I have tried to die," he said finally, his voice raw. "I have thrown myself upon blessed weapons, sought the sun's cleansing fire, drunk holy water until my insides burned like acid. But the curse that made me also protects me from easy escape. I am bound to this existence until some force greater than my will releases me. And so I endure century after century, watching the world change, while I remain frozen in this grotesque parody of life." The clock struck midnight, marking the passage into a new day. Elena realized with a start that hours had passed since she had opened her door to this impossible guest. She should be terrified. She should be planning escape. Instead, she felt only a profound sadness for this creature whose suffering transcended anything she had imagined possible. "You said you were seeking something," she prompted gently. "What is it you hope to find?" Dracula's expression became distant, haunted by memories too painful to fully articulate. "I search for what I can never reclaim, my humanity, my soul. Some proof that beneath the monster, some fragment of the man I once was still remains. I travel from place to place, trying to remember what it felt like to be mortal, to have purpose beyond mere survival, to connect with others without the specter of death hanging over every interaction." He looked at her then with such naked vulnerability that Elena's heart ached. "You asked why I came here. The truth is, I saw your light through the storm and felt drawn to it in a way I cannot explain. It seemed to promise something I have not felt in so very long. Warmth, not of body, but of spirit. The possibility, however fleeting, that I might sit across from another soul and feel less utterly alone." Elena stood slowly and moved around the table. Dracula tensed, his body coiling with inhuman readiness, but she simply extended her hand to him. "Then let us sit by the fire, and you can tell me more. The storm shows no sign of breaking, and I find I am not ready for this conversation to end." He stared at her offered hand as though it were a miracle or a trap, perhaps both. Then, with infinite care, he reached up and took it. His touch was cold beyond anything natural, the flesh of the grave given terrible animation, but Elena did not pull away. She led him to the chairs before the hearth and settled him in one while she took the other. And there they sat as the night deepened and the storm raged on. A mortal woman and an immortal monster speaking of life and death and the strange twilight realm between them. Elena asked questions no one had ever dared to ask, and Dracula answered with an honesty born of desperate loneliness. They spoke of philosophy and morality, of whether damnation could be overcome, and if redemption was possible even for those who had committed unforgivable acts. As dawn approached, still hidden behind the thick curtain of storm clouds, Elena found herself facing a choice she had never imagined she would have to make. The creature beside her was undeniably dangerous, a predator whose very nature demanded blood. Yet she could not deny the humanity she had glimpsed beneath his monstrous exterior, the suffering soul that longed for connection and peace. "The storm will break soon," Dracula said quietly, sensing the approaching dawn even through the perpetual darkness of the blizzard. "I must leave before the sun rises. Even on a day like this, its light can find me." "Will you come back?" The question escaped Elena before she could consider its wisdom. Dracula turned to her, his ancient eyes searching hers. "Do you wish me to? Knowing what I am, understanding the danger I represent." Elena thought of Thomas, of love and loss, of loneliness and the desperate human need for connection. She thought of the monster who had spoken to her with such painful honesty, who had restrained the hunger she knew must be tearing at him, who had treated her with courtesy and respect even when he might have simply taken what he needed by force. "Yes," she said simply, "I think perhaps we both have more to learn from each other." A smile crossed his features, transforming his face from something frightening into something almost beautiful. "Then I will return, if you truly wish it. Though I warn you, to associate with one such as I is to court danger and damnation." "I have been alone too long," Elena replied, "and I think perhaps so have you. Whatever comes of this, at least we will face it knowing that for one night, neither of us had to endure our solitude alone." Dracula rose and moved to collect his cloak. Elena walked with him to the door, and as she opened it onto the still raging storm, he turned to her one final time. "You have given me a gift tonight, Elena Cartwright. You have reminded me what it feels like to be treated as a man rather than a monster. I will not forget this kindness, and I pray you will not come to regret it." Then he stepped out into the storm and was swallowed by the darkness and snow, leaving Elena standing in the doorway wondering if the entire encounter had been a dream born of loneliness and storm madness. But the second bowl on her table, still full of cold stew and the lingering chill in the chair where he had sat, told her it had all been terribly, impossibly real. She had invited a stranger to dinner and discovered he was Count Dracula himself. And somehow, against all reason and wisdom, she had agreed to see him again. As she closed the door against the storm and returned to her fire, Elena knew that her life had changed irrevocably. She had stepped across a threshold from which there could be no return, and whatever lay ahead, it would be anything but ordinary. The storm continued through the morning, and Elena did not sleep. She sat before the fire, replaying every word of their conversation, trying to reconcile the monster of legend with the tormented soul who had sat in her home and spoken of loneliness and loss. When the storm finally broke near midday, revealing a world transformed by snow, she found herself watching the road, already anticipating the next time darkness would fall and a particular shadow might detach itself from the forest and make its way to her door. She had opened her heart to the impossible, and there was no closing it again. Whatever came next, she would face it with her eyes open, knowing that she had chosen compassion over fear and connection over safety. It was what Thomas would have done. It was what her own heart demanded. And somewhere in the mountains, Count Dracula walked through the snow thinking of warm firelight, and a woman who had looked upon his true face without screaming, who had offered him something he had not tasted in centuries, simple, uncomplicated kindness. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something other than hunger or despair. He felt hope. 3 nights passed before Count Dracula returned, 3 nights during which Elena found herself unable to settle into any normal routine. She would catch herself staring at the door, listening for footsteps that did not come, questioning whether the entire encounter had been some fever dream conjured by isolation and grief. But the memory remained too vivid, too detailed to be dismissed as imagination. The cold touch of his hand, the ancient sorrow in his eyes, the terrible beauty of his confession, all of it had been real. The villagers had noticed her distraction. Old Maria, who brought milk and eggs from the valley twice a week, had commented on Elena's pallor and the dark circles beneath her eyes. She had pressed a bundle of herbs into Elena's hands, muttering prayers in the old language and warning her to keep her windows shuttered after dark. Elena had accepted the herbs with thanks, but could not bring herself to explain that her sleeplessness had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with anticipation. On the fourth night, as Elena prepared a simple supper she knew she would eat alone, the knock came again. 3 measured raps, identical to the first time, as though he had stood outside rehearsing the exact amount of force and rhythm that would announce his presence without alarming her. She set down the knife she had been using to slice bread and moved to the door, her heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with terror. When she opened it, he stood exactly as he had before, tall and still as a carved monument, his dark cloak dusted with the evening frost. But something was different this time. His posture seemed less certain, his expression more openly vulnerable, as though the intervening days had stripped away some protective layer and left him exposed. "Good evening, Elena," he said quietly. "I hope my return does not displease you. I would understand if you had reconsidered your invitation in the cold light of day." "I have thought of little else," Elena replied honestly. "Please come in." He crossed the threshold with visible relief, and this time Elena noticed details she had missed during their first encounter. The way he moved with preternatural grace, each gesture flowing into the next with inhuman precision. The absolute absence of breath, his chest did not rise and fall as it should. The manner in which shadows seemed to cling to him even in the firelight, as though darkness itself recognized him as kin. She took his cloak and hung it by the door, noting again how his touch left her fingers aching with cold. "I was not certain you would come back," she admitted. "I nearly did not." Dracula moved to stand before the fire, though she suspected he took no warmth from it. "I told myself that to return would be selfish, that I endangered you simply by my presence. But I found I could not stay away. Your kindness haunts me, Elena. It troubles my rest and fills my thoughts in a way nothing has for centuries. Then I am glad you came." Elena gestured to the chairs by the hearth. "Sit, please. I know you cannot share my meal, but perhaps we might share conversation again." They settled into the same positions as before, and for a moment neither spoke. The fire crackled between them, casting its warm glow over Elena's face, while leaving Dracula's features half in shadow. When he finally broke the silence, his voice carried a weight of confession. "I have spent these past nights walking the mountains, trying to understand what happened here. I have encountered thousands of mortals in my existence, Elena. I have seduced them, hunted them, killed them. I have made some into creatures like myself and watched them descend into the same horror that consumes me. But never, not once in 400 years, has any mortal looked upon my true nature and responded with compassion rather than revulsion." He leaned forward, his dark eyes intense. "You should fear me. Your instincts should scream at you to flee. Yet you sit calmly in my presence, as though I were merely an unusual guest rather than a predator, who could end your life before you could draw breath to scream. Why? What madness or courage compels you to welcome me into your home?" Elena considered the question carefully. She had asked herself the same thing during the long days of waiting, examining her motivations with brutal honesty. "When Thomas died, I learned something about loneliness. It is not merely the absence of company, it is a hunger of its own kind, a slow starvation of the soul. I saw that same hunger in you, Count Dracula, despite all your power and immortality. Perhaps I recognized a kindred spirit, someone who understands what it means to exist rather than truly live." She paused, choosing her next words with care. "But there is more than that. You spoke to me as one soul to another without pretense or calculation. You confessed your nature when you might have hidden it. You restrained yourself when you might have taken what you needed by force. These are not the actions of a mindless monster, but of a man still struggling with his humanity. How could I do less than respond with equal honesty? Dracula closed his eyes, and Elena saw his jaw tighten, as though her words caused him physical pain. You credit me with nobility I do not possess. I restrain myself through force of will, Elena, but the hunger is always there. Even now, sitting here with you, I am acutely aware of the blood that flows through your veins. I can hear your heartbeat as clearly as you hear my voice. The scent of your mortality fills this room like the sweetest perfume, calling to instincts I can never fully suppress. He opened his eyes and fixed her with a gaze of terrible honesty. I am a monster wearing the mask of a man. Do not mistake my courtesy for safety or my words for redemption. I have killed innocents without number. I have destroyed lives and families and entire bloodlines in my endless hunger. The man I once was died centuries ago in a moment of weakness and rage, and what remains is merely an echo wrapped in flesh that should be mouldering in the grave. Do you believe that? Elena asked quietly. Truly? Because the creature you describe would not have knocked on my door asking permission to enter. It would not have spent hours in conversation when it might have spent minutes feeding. It would not have left me unharmed when I was completely at its mercy. Perhaps I am simply biding my time, Dracula said, but there was no conviction in his words. No. Elena shook her head. I think you are testing yourself. You came here seeking something you could not name, and when you found kindness instead of fear, it awakened something in you. You returned tonight not to hunt, but to see if that awakening was real or merely a momentary aberration. Dracula stared at her for a long moment, then released a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. You see too clearly. It is dangerous to be so perceptive in the presence of creatures like me. We do not appreciate being understood. It strips away the mystery that protects us from confronting what we have become. Then perhaps it is time to confront it, Elena suggested gently. You spoke of searching for your lost humanity. But how can you find it if you never allow yourself to be truly seen? The vampire lord rose abruptly and moved to the window, staring out at the darkness beyond. You ask me to strip away centuries of armor, to expose the raw wound that I have learned to cover with cruelty and power. Do you understand what you are asking? To face my true self is to face the enormity of what I have done, the countless lives I have destroyed, the innocence I have corrupted. It is to acknowledge that I am irredeemable, damned beyond any possibility of salvation. Or it is to acknowledge that you still care enough to be tormented by your actions, Elena countered. A true monster would feel no guilt. It would glory in its power and take pleasure in the suffering it causes. You do not. You carry the weight of your sins like chains, and that alone suggests the man you were is not entirely lost. Dracula turned from the window, and in his face Elena saw a war between hope and despair. What do you want from me, Elena Cartwright? Why do you persist in seeing good where only darkness exists? I want nothing from you, Elena said simply. But I offer you something freely, a space where you need not be the monster everyone expects, a few hours where you can simply be, without judgment or fear or the need to maintain the terrible legend you have become. Is that not what you sought when you first knocked on my door? The vampire lord returned to his chair, moving with an air of defeat that made him seem suddenly vulnerable despite his obvious power. You are either the bravest woman I have ever encountered, or the most foolish. But yes, that is precisely what I sought. A moment of peace, a conversation with someone who sees me as more than a source of terror, the illusion, however brief, that I am still capable of human connection. Then let us have that, Elena said softly. Tell me of your life before the curse. Who were you, Count Dracula, when you were still a man? And so he spoke, his voice taking on a different quality as he reached back through centuries to remember the person he had been. He told her of his youth in the Principality of Wallachia, of a land constantly threatened by Ottoman invasions and internal betrayal. He described his education at the court of the Hungarian king, where he had learned the arts of war and governance, alongside the principles of chivalry that had shaped his early understanding of honor. He spoke of his father, Vlad Dracul, whose alliance with the Order of the Dragon had given their family both power and enemies. He recounted his years as a hostage in the Ottoman court, where he had learned to hide his true thoughts behind a mask of compliance, while his hatred for his captors grew like poison in his heart. He told her of his return to Wallachia and his assumption of the throne, driven by a desire to protect his people from the very empire that had held him captive. "I was not a gentle ruler," he admitted. "I believed in strength and feared that any sign of weakness would invite destruction. I was harsh with traitors and merciless with enemies, but I genuinely believed I was doing what was necessary to preserve my people and their freedom. I was a man, Elena, with a man's flaws and a man's justifications for his cruelty." "What changed?" Elena asked. "How did that man become what you are now?" Dracula's expression darkened, and for a moment Elena thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, filled with such anguish that it made her chest ache in sympathy. "Betrayal, loss, rage beyond all reason or restraint." He stared into the fire as though seeing scenes played out in the flames. "I had a wife, Elena, Elisabetta. She was gentle where I was harsh, kind where I was cruel. She represented everything good in me, the humanity I struggled to maintain in the face of endless war and political makery. She was my conscience, my compass, the reason I fought to be something more than the monster my enemies claimed I was." He paused, his hands clenching on the arms of the chair with such force that Elena heard the wood creak in protest. "My enemies knew this. They knew that to destroy me, they had only to destroy her. So they sent a message, a lie claiming I had been killed in battle. Elisabetta, believing me dead, threw herself from the tower of our castle into the river below. When I returned victorious from the campaign that was supposed to have killed me, I found her broken body already cold." Elena felt tears spring to her eyes at the raw grief in his voice. She said nothing, sensing that he needed to speak this truth aloud, perhaps for the first time in centuries. "The priests would not give her a Christian burial," Dracula continued, his voice hardening. "They said that suicides were damned, that she had forfeited her soul by taking her own life. They refused to consecrate her body or speak prayers over her grave. They condemned the woman I loved, the purest soul I had ever known, to eternal damnation because she could not bear the pain of living without me." His eyes, when he turned them to Elena, blazed with an ancient fury. "I renounced God that day. I cursed heaven and all its empty promises. I swore that if this was divine justice, then I wanted no part of it. I would rather reign in hell than serve in such a heaven. And in my rage and blasphemy, I opened myself to darkness I did not fully understand." "The curse found you," Elena said quietly. "Or I found it. Or perhaps we found each other. Rage and darkness meeting in a moment of perfect synchronicity." Dracula leaned back in his chair, the fury draining from him to be replaced by weary resignation. "I do not remember the exact moment of transformation. I remember only that one night I was a man drowning in grief and anger, and the next I was something else, something powerful and terrible and utterly damned. I had been granted immortality, but at the cost of everything that made mortality worthwhile." He looked at her with eyes that held centuries of regret. "I became the very monster I had once fought against. I terrorized my own people. I turned my castle into a charnel house. I spread darkness and death across the land I had once struggled to protect, all because I could not bear my grief like a man, and instead chose to become something that could not feel pain, because it could no longer truly feel anything at all." The confession hung between them, heavy with the weight of centuries. Elena found herself rising from her chair and crossing to where he sat. She knelt before him, bringing herself to eye level, and took his cold hands in her warm ones. He flinched at the contact but did not pull away. "You feel pain now," she said firmly. "I can see it in every line of your face, hear it in every word you speak. You are not the dead thing you claim to be. You are a man in torment, still grieving a loss that would have destroyed anyone. The fact that you carry that grief after so long speaks to the depth of your love, not the absence of your humanity." "Love?" Dracula's voice was bitter. "What I feel is a mockery of love. It is obsession without warmth, memory without healing. I have spent 4 centuries unable to move beyond that moment when I found her body in the river. Every woman I have encountered since has been measured against her and found wanting. Every attempt at connection has failed because I cannot forget what I lost. This is not love, Elena. It is a prison of my own making." "Perhaps," Elena acknowledged. "Or perhaps it is simply that you have never allowed yourself to grieve properly. You transformed your pain into rage, and your rage into power, but you never actually mourned the woman you loved. You never said goodbye." Dracula pulled his hands from hers and stood abruptly, moving away from her as though her words had struck too close to some unbearable truth. "You speak of things you cannot understand. Goodbye? How does one say goodbye to the reason for one's existence? How does one move forward when moving forward means accepting that she is gone forever, and I must continue without her?" "I do understand," Elena said, rising to her feet. "Not the centuries of it, perhaps, but the grief itself. When Thomas died, I wanted to die with him. For months I merely existed, going through the motions of life, without truly living. But slowly, painfully, I learned that honoring his memory did not mean stopping my own life. It meant carrying him forward with me, keeping the best parts of what we shared alive, even as I acknowledged he was gone." She moved to stand beside him at the window, both of them staring out at the night. "You have never allowed yourself to honor Elisabetta properly. You have made her memory a weapon to punish yourself with, a reason to embrace damnation, rather than an inspiration to reclaim the man she loved. If she could see what you have become, do you think she would be pleased? Or would she weep for the destruction you have wrought in her name?" The vampire lord's shoulders sagged, and for the first time since Elena had met him, he looked not powerful or terrifying, but simply broken. "She would weep. She would beg me to stop, to remember the man I was before grief consumed me. She always believed I could be better than my worst impulses. She saw in me nobility I was never certain I possessed." "Then perhaps it is time to prove her faith was not misplaced," Elena suggested gently. "Not by denying what you are, that would be impossible, but by choosing to be something more than the sum of your hunger and rage. You have the power to be a monster, or the strength to be a man struggling against monstrous nature. The choice, Count Dracula, is yours." He turned to her, and in his ancient eyes she saw something shifting, some fundamental understanding taking root. "You ask me to attempt the impossible, to fight against my own nature every moment of every night for the rest of eternity. Do you understand the burden of that struggle?" "Yes," Elena said simply. "It is the same struggle every person faces, the choice to be better than our worst impulses, to act with compassion even when fear or anger would be easier. You carry it across a longer span, but the challenge itself is universal. You are not as different from mortals as you believe." Dracula studied her face as though seeing her clearly for the first time. "You are remarkable. Facing a creature of darkness with nothing but words and conviction, offering hope to something that should be beyond redemption. Either you are touched by divine grace or divine madness." "Perhaps both," Elena said with a small smile. "But I believe what I am saying. I believe that the man who loved Elisabetta enough to grieve for 4 centuries still exists beneath the monster. I believe that same man is standing here now, listening to me, and wanting desperately to believe that change is possible even for the damned." For a long moment, Dracula said nothing. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I want to believe. I have not wanted anything beyond blood and oblivion for so long that the desire itself feels foreign. But yes, I want to believe that I might be something other than what I have become. I want to hope that somewhere in this endless night, there might be a path back to the man I was." "Then take the first step," Elena urged. "Stay here. Talk with me. Practice being human again, even if only for a few hours at a time. Let me help you remember what it felt like to connect with another soul without hunger or fear overshadowing everything." "And what do you gain from this?" Dracula asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Why would you risk yourself to help me?" Elena thought of her lonely cottage, of endless days with no one to speak to but herself, of the slow erosion of purpose that came with isolation. She thought of the spark of genuine connection she had felt during their first conversation, the sense that for the first time since Thomas's death, she had encountered someone who truly understood loneliness. "Companionship," she said honestly. Purpose. The knowledge that I am doing something that matters. You said you search for your lost humanity. Well, I have been searching for a reason to feel human again myself. Perhaps we can help each other find what we have lost. The vampire lord looked at her for a long time, searching her face for deception or hidden motive. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because finally he inclined his head in acceptance. Very well, I will accept your offer, though I warn you again that you are inviting danger into your life. I am not tame, Elena. The hunger never stops, and there will be moments when my control wavers. Promise me that if I ever lose that control, you will not hesitate to protect yourself by any means necessary. I promise, Elena said, though she was not certain she could keep such a promise if the moment came. Then we have an accord. Dracula moved back to his chair and settled into it with visible weariness. Tell me, Elena Cartwright, what shall we speak of tonight? More of my sordid history? Or perhaps you might share something of yourself so I'm not the only one bearing his soul to relative strangers. And so the tone shifted, becoming less confessional and more conversational. Elena spoke of her childhood in England, of her courtship with Thomas, and their decision to seek adventure in foreign lands. She told him of their journey to Romania, of falling in love with these wild mountains and the Gothic beauty of the landscape. She described the early days of their marriage, full of hope and plans for the future, and then the terrible, swift illness that had stolen him from her. Dracula listened with focused attention, occasionally asking questions that revealed genuine interest in her story. As she spoke, Elena realized she had not talked about Thomas in depth with anyone since his death. The villagers had offered sympathy, but did not truly know her. This creature of darkness, ironically, was the first being who seemed to understand the nuances of her grief and loss. They talked through the night, ranging across topics from philosophy to literature to the nature of existence itself. Dracula proved to be remarkably well educated, drawing on centuries of learning to reference works and authors from across the ages. Helena found herself intellectually challenged in a way she had not been since Thomas's death, her mind engaged and stimulated by their discourse. As dawn approached once more, Dracula rose reluctantly. I must leave before the sun rises. Even on cloudy days, its light is poison to me. Elena walked him to the door and helped him with his cloak. As she did so, she made a decision. Will you come again tomorrow night? If you wish it. I do, but Count Dracula, I have a request. He raised an eyebrow. Speak it. When you come, bring something that belonged to Elisabetta, some token or memento that you have kept through the centuries. If we are to help you heal, we must first acknowledge your grief properly. It is time, I think, for you to truly mourn the woman you loved, rather than simply rage at her loss. The vampire lord's expression became unreadable. For a moment, Elena thought she had overstepped, that he would refuse or become angry. But then, something in his face softened, vulnerability replacing the careful mask he usually wore. You ask a difficult thing. But yes, I will bring something of hers tomorrow. Perhaps you are right. Perhaps it is past time I learned to grieve like a man rather than curse like a monster. He stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness, then paused and turned back. Thank you, Elena, for seeing me, for listening, for offering hope to something that has dwelt in hopelessness for so long. Whatever comes of this strange companionship, know that you have already given me more than you can imagine. Then he was gone, dissolved into the shadows as though he had never been there at all. Elena stood in the doorway, watching the place where he had vanished, feeling the weight of what she had undertaken settling over her. She was trying to help a vampire reclaim his humanity, offering compassion to a creature that embodied death itself. It was madness, it was dangerous. It might very well cost her life or worse. But as she closed the door and turned back to her cottage, Elena felt something she had not felt since Thomas's death. Purpose. She was needed. Her compassion, her insight, her willingness to see beyond fear to the wounded soul beneath, all of it mattered. She was helping someone who needed help desperately, regardless of what that someone was. And if Dracula truly was beyond redemption, if the darkness had consumed him too completely for any light to penetrate, at least she would have tried. At least she would have offered kindness where only cruelty had existed before. As the sun rose over the mountains and Elena finally sought her bed, she whispered a prayer for guidance and strength. She had set her foot upon a path that might lead to salvation or damnation, and there was no way to know which until she reached its end. But she would walk it nonetheless, with open eyes and an open heart, offering hope to the hopeless and humanity to the inhuman. It was what Thomas would have done. It was what her own conscience demanded. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was what both she and Count Dracula needed to finally move beyond the grief that had frozen them both in place. Her for 3 years, him for 4 centuries. The following night arrived with an oppressive stillness that seemed to press against the walls of the cottage. Elena had spent the day in a state of nervous anticipation, unable to focus on any task for more than a few minutes. She had cleaned the already spotless rooms, prepared food she would not eat, and changed her dress 3 times before settling on a simple grey gown that seemed appropriate for the solemn nature of what she had planned. She had asked Dracula to bring a memento of his lost wife, understanding even as she made the request that she was asking him to open a wound that had never properly healed. But Elena believed with absolute conviction that healing could not begin until grief was acknowledged, that the vampire lord had spent centuries running from his pain rather than facing it. Tonight, if he trusted her enough to bring what she had asked for, they would begin the difficult work of helping him mourn properly. The knock came precisely at nightfall, and Elena opened the door to find Dracula standing in the gathering darkness. He wore the same dark clothing as before, but his expression was different, raw somehow, as though the anticipation of this evening had stripped away some of his carefully maintained composure. In his hands, he held a small wooden box, carved with intricate patterns that had been worn smooth by centuries of handling. "I brought what you asked," he said quietly, his voice tight with emotion. "Though I confess I nearly turned back a dozen times during the journey here. What you ask of me terrifies me more than any enemy I have ever faced." Elena stepped aside to let him enter. Facing our deepest pain always does, but running from it only allows it to fester and poison everything it touches. "Come, sit by the fire." They took their usual positions in the chairs before the hearth, but tonight the atmosphere was different. The easy conversation of previous evenings was replaced by a heavy tension, the weight of impending revelation hanging between them. Dracula held the wooden box on his lap, his fingers tracing its carved surface with unconscious tenderness. "I have not opened this in decades," he admitted. "I keep it with me always, carried from place to place as I wander, but I rarely allow myself to look at what it contains. The pain is too immediate, too fresh, despite the centuries that have passed." "What is inside?" Elena asked gently. Dracula's jaw tightened. "Pieces of her. Not literally, I am not that much of a monster, but objects that held her essence, that carried her scent and her touch. Things I salvaged from our chambers before I abandoned the castle to its decay and darkness." He lifted the lid slowly, reverently, and even from where she sat, Elena could see his hands trembling. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, were several small items. Dracula reached in and withdrew the first, a delicate gold ring set with a small ruby. "Her wedding ring," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I placed it on her finger myself, swearing vows I believed would bind us through this life and into whatever came after. I was wrong. Death separated us as completely as though we had never been joined at all." He set the ring on the arm of his chair and reached into the box again, this time withdrawing a length of ribbon, once white but now yellowed with age. "She wore this in her hair on the day we first met. I was 17, newly returned from my captivity in the Ottoman court, and she was the daughter of a neighboring lord. I saw her in the garden of my father's castle and thought she was an angel. This ribbon had come loose and was trailing in the wind. I caught it for her, and when our hands touched, I felt something I had never felt before. Peace." Elena watched as he ran the ribbon through his fingers, his ancient eyes distant with memory. "Tell me about her. Not about her death, but about who she was when she lived." Dracula looked up, surprise evident in his features. "You truly wish to know?" "Yes. If I am to help you mourn her properly, I need to understand what you lost. Not just that you lost a wife. but who she was as a person. What made her special? What did you love most about her? The vampire lord leaned back in his chair, the ribbon still clutched in his hand, and for the first time since Elena had met him, a genuine smile touched his lips. She was gentle in a world that prized cruelty, compassionate in an age that viewed compassion as weakness. She believed in the inherent goodness of people, even when all evidence suggested otherwise. He paused, his expression softening with the memory. I was harsh, Elena. I ruled with an iron hand and showed no mercy to traitors or enemies. The people feared me, and I told myself that fear was necessary for order. But Elisabetta saw the man beneath the tyrant. She would sit with me in the evenings and speak of kindness and forgiveness, of ruling with love rather than terror. I dismissed her ideas as naive, but in truth, her words troubled me because I knew she was right. She challenged you, Elena observed, constantly, but never with condemnation, always with hope. She believed I could be better than I was, and her belief made me want to prove her right. When I was tempted to execute a prisoner too hastily or punish a village too harshly, I would think of her disappointment and find myself searching for more measured responses. She was my conscience made flesh, the better angel of my nature. He reached into the box again and withdrew a small book, its leather cover cracked with age. Her prayer book. She was deeply devout, spending hours each day in prayer and contemplation. After her death, when I renounced God and embraced darkness, I kept this as a reminder of my apostasy. But now, holding it, I remember the peace that would settle over her face when she prayed. She had such absolute faith in divine mercy and love. If only that mercy had extended to her when she needed it most. The bitterness in his voice was palpable. Elena leaned forward slightly. You blame God for her death. I blame God for condemning her soul. She died because she believed I was dead, because she could not bear to live without me. Her suicide was an act of love, not sin. Yet the priest declared her damned and refused her the comfort of holy burial. What kind of God punishes devotion and despair equally? What kind of divine justice condemns a soul for loving too much? Perhaps the priests were wrong, Elena suggested quietly. Perhaps their understanding of God's mercy was too limited, too bound by rules and doctrine to encompass the complexity of human suffering. I do not believe Elisabetta is damned, Count Dracula. I believe a truly loving God would understand her pain and welcome her home. Dracula's eyes snapped to hers, and she saw in them a desperate hunger for those words to be true. You say that with such certainty. How can you believe in divine mercy when you have experienced loss yourself? Where was God when your Thomas died? Where was the mercy in leaving you alone? I do not pretend to understand the ways of providence, Elena admitted. I have questioned and raged and wept at the unfairness of losing Thomas, but I have also felt his presence in quiet moments, a sense that love does not end with death, but continues in ways we cannot fully comprehend. If that is true for Thomas and me, why should it not be true for you and Elisabetta? The vampire lord stared at her for a long moment, then looked down at the prayer book in his hands. I want to believe that. I want to believe she is at peace somewhere, that her soul was not cast into damnation for the crime of loving me. But if that is true, it means 4 centuries of rage and murder were for nothing. It means I destroyed myself and countless others based on a false understanding of her fate. Or it means you were in too much pain to see clearly, Elena countered gently. Grief distorts everything, Count Dracula. It makes us believe terrible things and act in ways we would never consider in clearer moments. You were not thinking rationally when you cursed God and embraced darkness. You were a man shattered by loss, lashing out at anything that might bear responsibility for your pain. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. But that was 4 centuries ago. You are not that man anymore, racked with fresh grief and blinded by rage. You have had time to reflect, to see the consequences of your choices. The question now is not what you did then, but what you choose to do moving forward. Dracula set the prayer book aside and withdrew the last item from the box, a small portrait painted on ivory, no larger than his palm. He stared at it for a long moment before turning it to show Elena. The woman in the portrait was beautiful in a quiet, serene way. She had dark eyes full of warmth and intelligence, delicate features, and a slight smile that suggested both gentleness and inner strength. "This is the only image of her that survived," he said softly. "I had it painted shortly before my final campaign, the one that led to the false report of my death. I carried it with me into battle as a talisman, a reminder of what I was fighting to protect. When I returned to find her dead, this portrait was the only thing that kept me from destroying myself immediately. I would stare at it for hours, memorizing every line of her face, torturing myself with the knowledge that I would never see her smile again." Elena studied the portrait carefully. The woman it depicted seemed to radiate kindness, even through the limitations of the medium. She was lovely. But more than that, she looks like someone who genuinely cared for others. I can see why she affected you so deeply. She was everything I was not, Dracula said, his voice raw. Pure where I was corrupted, gentle where I was violent, faithful where I was skeptical. I never understood what she saw in me. I was already a hard man when we married, already known for my cruelty to enemies. Yet she looked at me with such love, such absolute acceptance. She made me believe I might be worthy of redemption, despite all evidence to the contrary. He clutched the portrait tightly, his expression crumbling, and then she was gone. And with her went any hope I had of being better than my worst impulses. Without her guiding influence, without her faith in my potential for good, I became exactly what my enemies had always claimed, a monster without conscience or restraint. Elena rose from her chair and moved to kneel beside him, just as she had the previous night. She placed her hand over his where it gripped the portrait. "You are telling me that Elisabetta believed you could be redeemed, that she had faith in your capacity for goodness, even when you doubted it yourself. If that is true, then the greatest way to honor her memory is not to wallow in guilt and self-destruction, but to prove that her faith was justified, to become the man she believed you could be. I am a vampire, Elena. I am damned by my very nature. There is no redemption possible for creatures like me." Says who? The priests who condemned Elisabetta. The same religious authorities who value rigid doctrine over compassion and understanding. Why do you accept their judgment about your nature when you rejected their judgment about hers? The question hung in the air between them, and Elena watched as it struck home. Dracula's expression shifted, confusion and hope warring in his ancient eyes. "I never thought of it that way. I simply accepted that vampirism meant automatic damnation, that becoming this thing precluded any possibility of salvation." "But what if you are wrong?" Elena pressed. "What if redemption is not about what you are, but about the choices you make despite what you are? You have the power to kill and destroy, yes, but you also have the power to choose restraint, to use your strength to protect rather than harm. You demonstrated that when you came to my door, you chose to knock rather than break it down, to ask rather than take, to converse rather than consume. Those were all choices, Count Dracula, and they were the choices of a man, not a monster." He stared at her, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, something in him began to shift. It was not a sudden transformation, but rather a subtle cracking in the armor he had built around his heart, the first small breach in centuries of self-imposed damnation. "I do not know if I can do what you ask," he said finally. "The hunger is constant, Elena. The instinct to hunt and kill is woven into my very being. Resisting it requires every ounce of will I possess, and there are nights when that will falters. What happens if I fail? What happens if the monster wins?" "Then you try again the next night," Elena said simply. "Redemption is not a single grand gesture, but a series of small choices made over and over again. You will fail sometimes, all mortals do, but failure is not the same as damnation unless you allow it to become an excuse to stop trying." She gestured to the items he had removed from the box. "Elisabetta loved you despite your flaws. She saw your capacity for good even when you were at your worst. Do you truly believe she would want you to spend eternity punishing yourself for her death? Or would she want you to honor her memory by becoming the man she believed you could be?" Dracula closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, Elena saw tears glistening there. Impossible, given what he was, yet undeniably real. "She would want me to find peace. She would want me to let go of my rage and guilt. She would want me to remember that I was a man before I was a monster, and that perhaps with effort and grace I might become a man again. Then let us begin that work, Elena said gently. Tonight, here in this room, let us mourn her properly. Not with rage or self-destruction, but with genuine grief that acknowledges both the depth of your loss and the beauty of what you shared. Let us honor Elisabetta's memory, not by cursing heaven, but by remembering the love that made her loss so painful. The vampire lord nodded slowly, and together they spent the next hours doing something he had never allowed himself to do, truly mourn. Elena encouraged him to speak about Elisabetta not as a symbol of his damnation, but as a real woman with quirks and preferences and a life beyond her tragic death. He told stories of their courtship, of early disagreements and hard-won understanding, of shared laughter and quiet moments of companionship. As he spoke, the portrait still clutched in his hands, something remarkable happened. The bitter edge in his voice gradually softened. The rage that had characterized his earlier discussions of Elisabetta's death began to give way to genuine sorrow, the kind of clean grief that allows healing rather than festering. He wept, not with the violent despair of 4 centuries ago, but with the quiet, cathartic tears of a man finally allowing himself to feel the full weight of his loss without drowning in it. Elena wept with him, moved by the depth of his love and pain. She held his cold hand in her warm one and listened as he poured out centuries of accumulated grief, offering no judgment or platitudes, simply bearing witness to his suffering with compassionate silence. As the night wore on and their tears gradually subsided, Dracula carefully returned each item to its box, handling them with reverence, but no longer with the desperate clutching of someone trying to hold on to something already lost. When he closed the lid, it felt like the closing of a chapter rather than the sealing of a tomb. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I have carried these objects for centuries but never truly looked at what they represented. I used them as weapons to torture myself with, rather than treasures to remember her by. You have given me permission to grieve properly, to honor her memory without being consumed by guilt and rage." "It is not the end of grieving," Elena cautioned. "Healing is not a single evening's work. You will still have moments of pain and sorrow, but perhaps now they can be clean grief rather than poisoned rage." Dracula nodded, setting the box aside with care. "I feel lighter somehow, as though a weight I did not realize I was carrying has been partially lifted. Is this what peace feels like? I have been at war with myself for so long, I barely remember what it feels like to be at rest." "It is the beginning of peace," Elena confirmed, "the first tentative steps toward healing, but there is more work to be done." "Tell me," he said, his voice steadier than it had been all evening. Elena took a deep breath, knowing her next words might be difficult for him to hear. "You must forgive yourself. You have mourned Elisabetta tonight, acknowledged your love for her and the magnitude of your loss. But you are still punishing yourself for her death, still believing that you are responsible for her suicide. That guilt is what drove you to become the monster you believe yourself to be, and it will continue to poison any attempt at redemption until you release it." Dracula's expression hardened slightly. "How can I forgive myself? If I had returned sooner, if I had been more careful about my enemy's capacity for deception, if I had ensured she knew the truth of my survival, she would still be alive. Her death is directly attributable to my failures." "Her death is attributable to the enemies who lied about your fate," Elena corrected firmly. "To the cruelty of men who knew the best way to hurt you was through her. To the tragic circumstances of war and betrayal. You did not kill her, Count Dracula. You did not drive her to that tower. Your enemies did, and they have escaped your rage while you have turned it inward against yourself." She leaned forward, her eyes intent on his. "Elisabetta chose to take her own life. That was her decision, made in impossible circumstances and unbearable pain. But it was her choice, not one you made for her. You cannot carry responsibility for the actions of others, even those you loved. All you can do is honor her memory by becoming someone worthy of the love she gave you." The vampire lord sat in silence for a long moment, processing her words. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I do not know if I can forgive myself. The guilt has been my constant companion for so long. I barely know who I am without it." "Then, we will work on it together," Elena promised. "Not tonight. Tonight has been difficult enough. But in the nights to come, we will address this guilt and help you find a way to release it. You deserve peace, Count Dracula, even if you do not yet believe you do." He looked at her with an expression of wonder tinged with disbelief. "Why do you care so much about the redemption of a monster? What is it in your nature that compels you to offer hope to something that should be beyond saving?" Elena considered the question carefully. "Perhaps because I know what it is like to feel beyond saving. After Thomas died, I believed my life was over, that I had no purpose left. I existed but did not live. When you came to my door, I saw that same emptiness in you, the sense of merely enduring rather than truly experiencing existence. If I can help you find your way back to life, perhaps I can find my way back as well. We heal each other, Count Dracula. That is the nature of genuine compassion. It redeems both the giver and the receiver." Dracula reached out slowly and took her hand, his cold fingers intertwining with her warm ones. "You are a remarkable woman, Elena Cartwright. In all my centuries, I have never encountered anyone like you. You look at darkness without flinching and offer light without expecting anything in return. If there is any hope of redemption for me, it lies in learning to see myself as you seem to see me, not as an irredeemable monster, but as a man struggling against his nature and capable of choosing better." "That is exactly what you are," Elena affirmed, "and together we will help you remember that. Night by night, choice by choice, we will rebuild the man Elisabetta loved and believed in. Hey, it will not be easy and there will be setbacks, but I believe it is possible, and more importantly, I believe you are worth the effort." As dawn approached once more, Dracula prepared to leave, but there was something different in his bearing. The crushing weight of unprocessed grief seemed lighter, replaced by a tentative hope that perhaps change was possible. He gathered his cloak and the wooden box, holding the latter with new tenderness. "Tomorrow night?" he asked. "Tomorrow night," Elena confirmed, "and every night after, for as long as you need." He paused at the threshold and turned back to her. "I am beginning to understand why Elisabetta had such faith in humanity's capacity for goodness. She would have liked you, I think. You share her gift for seeing past the surface to the wounded soul beneath. Thank you for that gift, Elena. Thank you for helping me mourn properly after centuries of rage. Thank you for believing redemption is possible even for creatures like me." Then he stepped out into the fading darkness, and Elena closed the door behind him, her heart full of a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. They had taken a significant step tonight, moving from intellectual discussion to genuine emotional work. She had witnessed a vampire lord weep for his lost love and begin the difficult process of forgiveness and healing. It was only the beginning. There would be many more nights of difficult conversations and challenging revelations, but as Elena prepared for bed, watching the sun rise over the mountains, she felt certain that they were on the right path. Count Dracula was not beyond redemption. He was simply a man who had suffered more than most could imagine, who had made terrible choices from unbearable pain, and who now, finally, was ready to face his demons and choose differently. And she would be there beside him, offering support and compassion, helping him navigate the treacherous waters between damnation and salvation. It was dangerous, yes, but it was also profoundly meaningful, and Elena had not felt such purpose since Thomas's death. Whatever came next, she was ready to face it. For Count Dracula, for herself, and for the memory of all those who had believed in the power of compassion to transform even the darkest soul. The pattern of their nights together settled into a rhythm over the following weeks. Dracula would arrive shortly after sunset, and they would spend hours in deep conversation, exploring the complexities of his existence and the possibilities of redemption. Elena found herself looking forward to these visits with an intensity that surprised her, the evenings with the vampire lord becoming the focal point around which her days revolved. But as their connection deepened, so too did the complications. Elena had begun to notice changes in herself that troubled her, even as they thrilled her. She thought about Dracula constantly during the daylight hours, replaying their conversations and planning what she might say when he returned. She found herself dressing with more care, arranging her hair with attention she had not paid since Thomas's death. And most disturbingly, she had begun to dream of him, not nightmares of predation and fear, but dreams of a different nature entirely, dreams that left her flushed and confused upon waking. On this particular evening, as she prepared for his arrival, Elena forced herself to confront the truth she had been avoiding. She was developing feelings for Count Dracula that went beyond simple compassion or intellectual fascination. She was drawn to him in ways that were deeply inappropriate given what he was, and yet she could not deny the attraction. His intelligence engaged her mind, his vulnerability touched her heart, and his physical presence stirred something in her that had lain dormant since her husband's death. The knock came, and Elena took a moment to compose herself before opening the door. Dracula stood in his usual place, but tonight there was something different about him as well. He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch, and when their eyes met, she saw her own conflicted emotions reflected back at her. "Good evening, Elena," he said, his voice carrying a warmth it had lacked in their earlier encounters. "You look well tonight." "As do you," she replied, stepping aside to let him enter. It was true. While he would always possess the unnatural pallor of the undead, there was a vitality to him now that had been absent when they first met. The work they had been doing together had awakened something in him, brought him back from the edge of complete despair towards something resembling life. They settled into their chairs by the fire, but tonight the usual ease of their conversation was missing. A tension hung between them, unspoken but palpable. Elena could feel Dracula's eyes on her, studying her with an attention that went beyond mere interest. She found herself acutely aware of his presence, of the space between them that suddenly seemed both too large and dangerously small. "There is something I must tell you," Dracula said finally, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "Something I have been wrestling with for several nights now." Elena's heart began to race. "What is it?" He leaned forward, his hands clasped together as though he needed something to hold on to. "You have helped me tremendously over these past weeks. You have given me hope where I had none, shown me compassion I did not deserve, and helped me begin the difficult work of healing from centuries of pain. For all of this, I am profoundly grateful." He paused, and Elena saw conflict warring in his expression. "But in the process, something unexpected has occurred. I find myself thinking of you constantly. During the long hours of daylight when I rest in darkness, your face haunts my thoughts. Your voice echoes in my memory. Your kindness warms places in me I thought had frozen beyond all possibility of thaw." Elena's breath caught in her throat. She knew what he was about to say, and she should stop him, should redirect the conversation before they crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. But she remained silent, needing to hear the words, even as she feared them. "I am developing feelings for you, Elena," Dracula continued, his voice rough with emotion. "Feelings that go beyond gratitude or friendship. When I am with you, I feel almost human again. When I am away from you, I count the hours until I can return. This is dangerous for both of us, and I know I should stop coming here before these feelings deepen further. But I find I lack the strength to stay away." The confession hung between them, raw and vulnerable. Elena should respond with reason, should remind him of the impossibility of their situation, should protect them both from the consequences of such feelings. Instead, she heard herself saying, "I feel it too." Dracula's eyes widened, surprise and hope and fear mingling in his expression. "Elena, you cannot mean—" "But I do," she interrupted, the words tumbling out now that she had begun. "I tried to tell myself it was simply the loneliness, the isolation making me attach meaning to companionship that would fade if I had other options. But that is not true. I think of you constantly. I anticipate your arrival with more than friendly interest. When you look at me, I feel something I have not felt since Thomas was alive, the stirring of genuine emotion, of connection that transcends mere conversation." She stood abruptly and moved to the window, needing distance to continue. "This is madness. You are a vampire, a creature of darkness who sustains himself on blood. I am a mortal woman who should be terrified of you. By all rights, this attraction should not exist, yet it does, and I do not know what to do about it." She heard him rise and move toward her, felt his presence behind her like a cold wind. "We must do nothing about it," he said firmly. "These feelings, while genuine, can lead nowhere good. I am damned, Elena. To love me is to invite darkness into your life, to risk your soul and your sanity. I will not allow you to make that sacrifice." Elena turned to face him, and the anguish in his features nearly broke her heart. "Is that your decision to make? Do I not have agency in this matter?" "You do not understand what you would be choosing," Dracula insisted. "The hunger is always there, Elena. Right now, standing this close to you, I can hear your heartbeat like thunder. I can smell the blood flowing through your veins, warm and vital and calling to everything I am. It takes every ounce of control I possess not to reach for you, not to take what my nature demands." He backed away, putting distance between them as though proximity itself was dangerous. "If I were to act on these feelings, if I were to allow myself to love you as a man loves a woman, I would endanger you constantly. One moment of lost control, one instant when the hunger overwhelms my reason, and I would destroy you. I have done it before, Elena. I have killed those I cared for, drained them dry in moments of passion or need. I cannot risk that with you. I will not." "Then we exercise caution," Elena said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We acknowledge these feelings but maintain boundaries. We continue as we have been, working toward your redemption while being honest about the attraction between us." "And how long do you think such restraint can last?" Dracula challenged. "Feelings like these do not remain static, Elena. They grow and deepen and demand expression. Eventually we will reach a point where maintaining boundaries becomes impossible, and then what? Do we give in and risk your death? Or do I leave forever, knowing I have found something precious and must abandon it to keep you safe?" The question was impossible to answer, and they both knew it. Elena returned to her chair and sank into it, suddenly exhausted by the weight of their situation. "What would you have us do? Should you stop coming here? Should we end these visits and return to our separate loneliness?" "It would be the wise course," Dracula admitted, though his voice carried no conviction. "It would protect us both from the pain that inevitably comes from this impossible situation." "But you do not want to," Elena observed. "No." The word was torn from him. "I do not want to give this up. These evenings with you have become the center of my existence, the hours I live for. The thought of returning to my previous endless solitude, of never again seeing your face or hearing your voice is unbearable, but my wants are irrelevant if they put you in danger." Elena considered their dilemma carefully. She thought of Thomas, of the love they had shared and the promises she had made at his deathbed. She had sworn to honor his memory, to live fully rather than merely exist, to embrace life's possibilities even in the face of loss. Would he want her to deny these feelings out of fear? Or would he encourage her to pursue connection wherever she found it, even if that connection was unconventional and dangerous? "Count Dracula," she said finally, using his title with deliberate formality, "I propose a compromise. You continue to visit as you have been. We continue the work we have started, helping you reclaim your humanity and find peace with your past. But we also acknowledge these feelings openly rather than hiding from them. We talk about them, examine them, understand them. Perhaps in doing so we can find a way forward that does not require us to choose between connection and safety." He studied her face, searching for certainty or doubt. "You would risk this? Knowing the danger, understanding what I am, you would willingly choose to continue?" "I would," Elena confirmed. "Not recklessly, but with open eyes and honest communication. I believe the risk is worth the potential reward. You have said yourself that I have helped you begin to heal, to reclaim parts of your humanity you thought lost forever. Should we abandon that progress because we have developed feelings for each other? Or should we be mature enough to acknowledge those feelings while maintaining appropriate boundaries?" A smile touched Dracula's lips, sad but genuine. "You are either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. I have not decided which." "Perhaps both," Elena admitted, "but I am also honest, with you and with myself. I do not want you to stop coming here. I do not want to return to the emptiness that preceded your arrival. If we must navigate complicated feelings to maintain this connection, then that is what we shall do." Dracula returned to his chair and settled into it with visible relief. "Very well. We continue as we have been, but with honesty about what exists between us. Though I warn you, Elena, this path will not be easy. These feelings will test us in ways we cannot anticipate." "I know," Elena said quietly, "but I think perhaps that is the point. You spoke of reclaiming your humanity, of proving yourself capable of being something more than a monster. What better test of that than successfully navigating genuine emotion without allowing it to devolve into predation?" The observation struck him visibly. "You suggest that these feelings, rather than being an obstacle to my redemption, might actually be part of the process. Why not? Love, or the potential for love, is one of the most fundamentally human experiences. If you can feel such emotions and not act on your darker impulses, does that not suggest the man inside still lives? That you are capable of restraint and selfless concern for another's well-being?" Dracula leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "That is a dangerous philosophy. It could easily be used to justify giving in to these feelings, to pursuing intimacy that would almost certainly end in your death." "Which is why we must be honest and vigilant," Elena countered. "We must talk about this constantly, monitoring our emotions and maintaining boundaries. The moment either of us feels control slipping, we address it immediately. This only works if we are both committed to prioritizing safety over desire." "Can you do that?" Dracula asked, his dark eyes intense. "Can you truly commit to maintaining those boundaries even when emotion urges you to abandon them?" Elena met his gaze steadily. "Can you?" They stared at each other across the firelight, both understanding the magnitude of what they were undertaking. This was not a simple friendship, or even a straightforward romantic relationship. It was something far more complex and dangerous, an attraction between mortal and immortal, between prey and predator, between light and darkness. Success would require constant vigilance, brutal honesty, and reserves of self-control neither of them was certain they possessed. "I will try," Dracula said finally. "For you and for the man I am trying to become, I will exercise every bit of control I possess. But Elena, you must promise me something in return." "What?" "Promise me that if I ever lose control, if you ever see the monster gaining ascendancy over the man, you will run. You will not try to reach me or reason with me or appeal to my better nature. You will simply flee and never return. Promise me this, and I can continue these visits with some measure of peace regarding your safety." Elena wanted to protest, to insist that she would never abandon him regardless of circumstances, but she saw the desperate sincerity in his face and understood that he needed this promise to feel justified in continuing their relationship. "I promise. If you ever truly lose control, I will flee and not return." The tension that had filled the room since his arrival gradually dissipated, replaced by a different atmosphere entirely. They had acknowledged the elephant between them, and in doing so, had paradoxically made it easier to simply be together. They spent the rest of the evening in conversation, as they had on previous nights, but now with an undercurrent of acknowledged attraction that added new dimensions to their discourse. Dracula told her more of his mortal life, of the politics and warfare that had shaped him, of the moments of triumph and defeat that had defined his reign. Elena shared stories of her own life, of her childhood dreams and adult realities, of the adventures she and Thomas had shared, and the plans they had made for a future that never came. They spoke of philosophy and morality, of love and loss, of the nature of redemption, and whether true change was possible even for the damned. As the night progressed, Elena found herself studying Dracula with new appreciation. Beneath the pale skin and inhuman features lay a mind of remarkable depth and complexity. He was educated beyond anything she had encountered, drawing on centuries of learning to reference works and ideas from across human history. He was also surprisingly witty when he allowed himself to be, capable of dry observations that made her laugh despite the serious nature of their usual discussions. But it was his vulnerability that truly captivated her. This creature of terrifying power was willing to expose his deepest wounds, to speak honestly about his failures and fears, to admit uncertainty and seek guidance. That combination of strength and vulnerability was intoxicating in ways Elena had not anticipated. "You are staring," Dracula observed, a slight smile playing at his lips. Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I apologize. I was simply thinking about how unexpected all of this is. A few weeks ago, I was living in isolation, resigned to loneliness for the remainder of my days. Now I am sitting with a vampire lord, discussing philosophy and redemption, while acknowledging mutual attraction that should not exist. Life is strange." "Strange indeed," Dracula agreed. "Though I confess this strangeness is preferable to the alternative. You have given me something I thought lost forever, not just hope for redemption, but actual enjoyment of existence. When I am with you, I am not counting the hours until dawn or fighting the constant hunger. I'm simply present, engaged, alive in ways I have not been for centuries." "That is how I feel as well," Elena admitted. "For the first time since Thomas died, I am not merely enduring each day, but actually anticipating what comes next. You have given me purpose, Count Dracula. You have given me reason to care about tomorrow." They fell silent, the weight of their confessions settling over them. The fire had burned low and shadows crept across the room as the night deepened. Elena found herself wondering what would happen next, how this strange relationship would evolve, whether they could truly maintain the boundaries they had agreed upon, or whether emotion would eventually overwhelm reason. "Dawn approaches," Dracula said finally, rising from his chair with visible reluctance. "I must leave soon." Elena stood as well and walked with him to the door. As she retrieved his cloak, their hands brushed, and both of them froze at the contact. The simple touch seemed charged with electricity, intimate in a way that went beyond the physical. Dracula's eyes darkened, and Elena saw hunger there, not just for blood, but for connection, for touch, for the human intimacy he had denied himself for so long. She should step back. She should maintain distance. Instead, she found herself moving closer, drawn by an impulse she could not fully explain or resist. They stood facing each other mere inches apart, both of them trembling with the effort of restraint. "Elena," Dracula whispered, her name a prayer or a warning. "We should not—" "I know," she breathed, "but I want to." Slowly, giving him every opportunity to retreat, Elena reached up and placed her hand against his cheek. His skin was cold beneath her palm, unnaturally so, but she did not pull away. Dracula closed his eyes at her touch, and Elena saw his jaw clench as though the simple contact caused him physical pain. "Your warmth," he said hoarsely. "I had forgotten what it felt like to be touched with gentleness rather than fear. This is dangerous, Elena. Every instinct I possess is screaming at me to either flee or to pull you close and take what I need." "Which will you choose?" Elena asked, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. Dracula opened his eyes, and Elena saw the war raging within him reflected in their ancient depths. Hunger battled with restraint, desire with discipline, the monster with the man. For a long moment, the outcome hung in balance, and Elena understood with absolute clarity that her life might depend on which side won this internal struggle. Then, with infinite care, Dracula reached up and covered her hand with his own, pressing it more firmly against his face. The gesture was achingly tender, filled with longing but also with conscious choice. He was choosing touch over attack, connection over consumption, the man over the monster. "I choose to be worthy of your trust," he said quietly. "I choose to honor the faith you have placed in me. I choose to be the man Elisabetta believed I could be, the man you are helping me rediscover. But Elena, we must be careful. This—" He gestured to their joined hands, to the minimal distance between their bodies. "This is the edge of a precipice. One small step further, and we fall into something from which there may be no return." Elena nodded, understanding and appreciating his honesty. Slowly, reluctantly, she withdrew her hand and stepped back, putting necessary distance between them. "You are right. We have acknowledged our feelings, but we must not act upon them recklessly. Tomorrow night, we will return to our work with clearer understanding of what exists between us." Dracula pulled on his cloak, his movements careful and controlled. "Thank you for your restraint. I know it is difficult. The connection between us pulls like gravity, making separation require active effort. But that effort is necessary. if I am to prove myself capable of controlling my nature rather than being controlled by it. He moved to the door, then paused and turned back. Elena, I want you to know something. Regardless of what happens, regardless of whether I succeed in my redemption or ultimately fail, you have already given me an extraordinary gift. You have reminded me what it feels like to care for another soul, to want someone's happiness and safety more than I want my own desires satisfied. That alone is a form of redemption, perhaps the only kind truly available to creatures like me. It is not the only kind, Elena insisted. We have only begun this journey, Count Dracula. There is so much more work to do, so much more healing possible. Do not give up on full redemption simply because we have encountered an obstacle. A sad smile touched his lips. You have such faith. I pray it is not misplaced. Then he stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness and was gone, leaving Elena standing in the doorway with her heart racing and her mind full of thoughts she could not fully organize. She closed the door and leaned against it, trying to process what had just occurred. They had acknowledged their mutual attraction, established boundaries, and then immediately tested those boundaries with that charged moment of contact. It had been dangerous and foolish and absolutely necessary. They needed to understand what they were dealing with, needed to test the limits of restraint before emotion pushed them beyond the point of control. And Dracula had chosen well. He had accepted her touch, but not escalated it. He had allowed himself to feel the connection, but maintained the discipline necessary to prevent disaster. It was exactly what Elena had hoped for, proof that he could experience genuine emotion without allowing his darker nature to dominate. But it was also terrifying, because Elena knew that such restraint could not be maintained indefinitely. Feelings like theirs would not remain static. They would grow and deepen and eventually demand expression beyond chaste touches and longing glances. When that moment came, what would they choose? Could Dracula's hard-won self-control survive the test of genuine intimacy? Could Elena maintain her own boundaries if he reached for her with desire rather than hunger? She did not know. But as she prepared for bed, watching the sun rise over the mountains, Elena understood that they had crossed an important threshold tonight. They were no longer simply helper and helped, no longer just friends exploring philosophical questions. They were two souls drawn together by genuine attraction, attempting to navigate impossible circumstances with honesty and care. The path ahead was uncertain and dangerous, but Elena would walk it nonetheless because the alternative, returning to her previous loneliness, abandoning this connection that had given her life meaning again, was unthinkable. Whatever came, whether success or tragedy, at least she would face it knowing she had chosen love over fear, connection over safety, hope over resignation. And perhaps, just perhaps, that choice would help Count Dracula complete his long journey back to humanity. If her faith and attraction could give him reason to maintain control, to choose the man over the monster in every moment, then the risk was justified. She would be his anchor, his reminder of why restraint mattered, his living proof that redemption was possible even for the damned. It was a heavy burden to carry, but as Elena finally found sleep, she felt certain it was one worth bearing. The weeks that followed their confession were both beautiful and agonizing. Dracula came every night without fail, and their connection deepened with each passing conversation. They explored the boundaries of their attraction with careful deliberation, allowing small intimacies that tested his control without pushing beyond what was safe. A touch of hands, the brush of fingers through hair, moments of sitting close enough to feel each other's presence. All of these became part of their nightly ritual, proof that he could experience tenderness without succumbing to violence. But the strain was taking its toll on both of them. Elena could see it in the tightness around Dracula's eyes, in the way his hands would clench whenever she drew near, in the visible effort required for him to maintain composure. She felt it in herself as well, the growing desire for more than these careful touches, the longing for true intimacy that went beyond the boundaries they had established. On this particular night, nearly 2 months after their first meeting, Elena sensed that something was different the moment Dracula arrived. There was a tension in his bearing, a wildness in his eyes that she had not seen since their earliest encounters. He crossed the threshold with his usual courtesy, but his movements were less fluid than normal, as though he was fighting against some internal restraint. "What is wrong?" Elena asked immediately. concern overriding any greeting. Dracula moved to stand before the fire, keeping his back to her. I have not fed in weeks. I have been testing myself, seeing how long I can maintain control while denying the hunger. I thought perhaps if I could master this most fundamental need, I might prove myself truly capable of redemption. Elena's blood ran cold. Count Dracula, that is incredibly dangerous. You are starving yourself while spending every night in close proximity to... She could not finish the sentence. To pray, he completed, turning to face her. His features were gaunt, his skin even paler than usual, and his eyes held a feverish intensity that made him look both more human and more monstrous. Yes, I am aware of the danger, but I needed to know, Elena. I needed to understand whether my control is genuine, or merely the result of keeping the hunger sated. If I cannot resist you while starving, then all our work has been for nothing. I am simply a well-fed predator playing at humanity. This is not a fair test, Elena protested. You are putting yourself in an impossible position and then judging yourself harshly when you struggle. No one could maintain control under such circumstances. A man could, Dracula said quietly. A man does not need to fight the urge to kill his beloved. A man can be hungry and uncomfortable without becoming dangerous. If I am to truly reclaim my humanity, I must be capable of the same restraint. He moved toward her, and Elena saw him trembling with the effort of each step. I can hear your heartbeat from across the room. The scent of your blood fills my senses like the most intoxicating perfume. Every instinct I possess is screaming at me to close the distance between us and take what I need. But I will not. I refuse to become the monster again, no matter how the hunger claws at me. Elena should tell him to leave, should insist he go hunt before returning. But she found herself frozen in place, caught between fear and an inexplicable desire to help him through this test he had set for himself. What do you need from me? How can I help? Talk to me, Dracula said hoarsely. Remind me why restraint matters. Remind me of all we have discussed, all the progress I have made. Give me something to focus on besides the hunger. And so Elena spoke, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She reminded him of Elisabetta, of the man he had been before grief and rage consumed him. She spoke of the work they had done together, of the genuine emotion he had shown, of his capacity for choosing humanity over monstrosity. She talked about redemption and hope, and the possibility of salvation even for the damned. As she spoke, Dracula gradually calmed, his trembling subsiding as he focused on her words rather than his hunger. He moved to his chair and sank into it with visible exhaustion, and Elena saw that the crisis had passed. He had chosen restraint over instinct once again, had maintained control even while starving, but the cost was written clearly on his face. This kind of deprivation was unsustainable. He could not continue denying his nature indefinitely, without eventually losing the battle against it. You must feed, Elena said gently, not to prove anything to me or to yourself, but because denying your nature completely is not the same as mastering it. True control is not about starvation, but about choosing how and when to satisfy necessary needs. Dracula looked at her with haunted eyes. I know, but I am afraid, Elena. Afraid that if I allow myself to hunt, I will lose the humanity I have worked so hard to reclaim. Afraid that the act of killing will awaken the monster I have been trying to suppress. I have gone 2 months without taking a life, 2 months of choosing restraint. To break that now feels like failure. Elena moved to kneel beside his chair, taking his cold hand in both of hers. It is not failure to acknowledge biological necessity. You are a vampire, Count Dracula. That is your nature, and denying it completely is no more sustainable than a mortal refusing to eat. But you can choose how you feed, can exercise control and mercy even in satisfying your needs. How? He asked, desperate for answers. How do I feed without becoming the monster again? Elena had been thinking about this question for weeks, ever since she first understood the depth of his struggle. You told me once that you have killed countless innocents in your hunger, but you also said you could hear heartbeats and smell blood from great distances. Surely that means you could choose your victims carefully, selecting criminals or those already dying rather than innocents. You could take only what you need rather than draining victims completely. You could even make amends afterward, leaving resources for families of those you feed from. She squeezed his hand. Feeding does not have to mean becoming a mindless killer. It can be an act you perform with consciousness and conscience, making choices that minimize harm while acknowledging your nature. That is what true redemption looks like, not denying what you are, but choosing to be the best version of what you are. Dracula stared at her as though she had offered him a revelation. I never considered that approach. I always saw my feeding as an all-or-nothing proposition. Either I am the monster who kills indiscriminately, or I starve myself, trying to deny my nature entirely. But you suggest a middle path, one where I acknowledge my needs, but exercise ethical judgment in satisfying them. Exactly, Elena confirmed. You cannot change what you are, but you can change how you are. That is the essence of redemption, not transformation into something else, but conscious choice in how you express your nature. The vampire lord closed his eyes, and Elena saw tears slip down his pale cheeks. You make it sound possible. You make me believe I can be something more than a monster without denying reality. This is what Elisabetta would have said, I think. She always believed in finding ethical paths through impossible situations. Then honor her memory by attempting it, Elena urged. Go tonight before you become too weak to maintain control. Hunt with conscience and restraint. Prove to yourself that you can satisfy your needs without abandoning your humanity. Dracula opened his eyes and looked at her with an expression of profound gratitude, mixed with lingering fear. Will you be here when I return? Will you still welcome me after I have fed, knowing I have taken a life to sustain my own? I will be here, Elena promised, because I understand that your survival requires sustenance just as mine does. The question is not whether you feed, but how you choose to do so. If you feed with conscience and restraint, as we have discussed, then you have nothing to be ashamed of. He rose slowly, gathering his strength. I will do as you suggest. I will hunt carefully, choosing one who would die soon in any case, or who has committed crimes that warrant judgment. I will take only what I need and no more. And I will return to you having proved that feeding does not require me to become the monster I once was. Elena stood and helped him with his cloak, their hands lingering together in the exchange. I believe in you. I believe you can do this ethically. But Count Dracula, you must promise me something. Anything. Promise me that after tonight you will feed regularly. Not this starvation that tests your limits, but regular sustenance that allows you to maintain control. I would rather you feed once a week with conscience than push yourself to the breaking point trying to prove something that needs no proof. He nodded solemnly. I promise you are right. Denying necessity is not virtue, it is simply prideful folly. I will maintain myself properly, exercising ethical judgment, but not attempting to transcend my nature entirely. They moved to the door together, and before he left, Dracula turned to her one final time. Elena, I must tell you something before I go. These months with you have been the most meaningful of my entire existence, mortal and immortal combined. You have given me hope, purpose, and something I thought lost forever, the possibility of love without destruction. Whatever happens tonight or in the nights to come, know that you have already redeemed me in ways that matter more than any divine judgment. Elena felt tears spring to her eyes. You have given me the same gifts. You have reminded me that life continues even after loss. That connection is possible even in the most unexpected circumstances, that love can bloom in the darkest soil. She paused, the words catching in her throat. I love you, Count Dracula. I know I should not, know it is dangerous and impossible, but I cannot deny the truth. I love you. The confession hung between them, raw and undeniable. Dracula's expression transformed, shifting through shock to wonder to something that looked almost like pain. Elena, you cannot. To love me is to invite tragedy. I am damned, cursed, a creature of darkness who will eventually fail and destroy everything he touches. Perhaps, Elena acknowledged, or perhaps love is what will ultimately save you. Not romantic love alone, but the combination of compassion, faith, and genuine emotional connection. You have been alone for so long, punishing yourself for crimes both real and imagined. Maybe what you need is not more suffering, but the radical grace of being loved despite your flaws. Dracula reached out and cupped her face with both hands, his touch cold but infinitely gentle. I love you too. I have fought against this feeling, tried to convince myself it was merely gratitude or the echo of lost love. But it is neither of those things. I love you, Elena Cartwright, with whatever capacity for love remains in this cursed existence. You are warmth in my darkness, hope in my despair, the reason I fight to be more than the monster I became. They stood there, foreheads touching, sharing breath in the space between them. It would be so easy to cross the final boundary, to give in to the desire that had been building for months. But Dracula pulled back with visible effort, maintaining the discipline they had both agreed was necessary. I must go, he said raggedly, before my weakened state overcomes my judgment, but I will return before dawn, and we will speak more of this confession and what it means for us both. Then he was gone, melting into the darkness with supernatural speed. Elena closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding and her mind reeling from what they had just confessed. Love. They loved each other. A mortal woman and an immortal vampire, drawn together by impossible attraction and kept apart by necessary restraint. She did not know what this meant for their future, whether such love could ever be consummated without tragedy, whether they could build something lasting from such impossible foundations, but she knew with absolute certainty that her confession had been true. She loved him, not despite what he was, but including what he was. The vampire and the man, the monster and the soul struggling toward redemption, all of it together formed the being she had come to care for so deeply. Hours passed as Elena waited for his return, alternating between hope and anxiety. Had she done the right thing encouraging him to feed? Would he maintain the ethical discipline they had discussed, or would the act of hunting awaken darker impulses? She tried to occupy herself with reading, but could not focus, her thoughts constantly returning to Dracula and wondering what was happening in the darkness beyond her walls. Finally, as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the knock came. Elena rushed to the door and threw it open to find Dracula standing there. He looked different. His color had improved slightly. The gauntness had left his features and his eyes held a clarity they had lacked earlier. But there was also something haunted in his expression, a weight of fresh memory that suggested the night had been difficult. "Come in," Elena said urgently. "Tell me what happened." Dracula entered and moved immediately to his chair, sinking into it as though exhausted despite his improved physical state. Elena took her own seat and waited, giving him time to gather his thoughts. "I did as you suggested," he began slowly. "I hunted with conscience and purpose, rather than mindless hunger. I found a man in a village 20 miles from here, a brutal husband who had beaten his wife to the point of death. I could smell her blood even from outside their home, could hear her labored breathing as she struggled to live. He was drunk, celebrating the violence he had inflicted, utterly, without remorse." Dracula's hands clenched on the arms of the chair. "I took him. I fed from him until he was too weak to continue his cruelty, but not dead. Then I left gold enough to support his wife and children for years, and I made certain she understood that her tormentor would not wake for many hours. When he does wake, he will be weak and confused, with no memory of what occurred. She will have time to flee if she chooses, and resources to build a new life." He looked up at Elena, his eyes searching hers for judgment or acceptance. "I fed with purpose and restraint. I chose a victim who arguably deserved consequences for his actions. I minimized harm and provided compensation. But Elena, I still took blood. I still drank from a living human being, still felt the rush of life flowing into me, still experienced the dark pleasure of the hunt. Can that truly be called ethical? Or am I simply finding sophisticated justifications for my monstrous nature?" Elena considered his question carefully. "You exercise judgment, restraint, and compassion within the constraints of your nature. You did not kill. You did not take an innocent. You provided help to someone in desperate need. Yes, you are still a predator, and yes, feeding will always carry moral complexity. But what you did tonight was fundamentally different from mindless slaughter. It was conscious, purposeful, and as ethical as your nature allows." She leaned forward. "Count Dracula, Redemption does not mean becoming something you are not. It means being the best possible version of what you are. A vampire who feeds with conscience and restraint, who uses his power to protect as well as sustain himself, who minimizes harm and provides compensation, that is a redeemed vampire. You may never be mortal again, but you can be a moral immortal. Dracula absorbed her words in silence, and gradually Elena saw something shift in his expression. The haunted look faded, replaced by tentative acceptance. I never imagined redemption in those terms. I always believed I had to somehow transcend my vampiric nature to be worthy of salvation. But you suggest I can be both vampire and ethical being, that my nature and my morality can coexist rather than being mutually exclusive. Exactly, Elena confirmed. And if you can maintain this approach, feeding regularly with conscience and care, you will have achieved something truly remarkable. You will have proved that even creatures of darkness can choose light, that damnation is not absolute, that change is possible even for those who have fallen furthest. The vampire lord rose and moved to stand before Elena's chair. He extended his hand to her, and when she took it, he drew her to her feet so they stood facing each other. You have given me so much: hope, purpose, ethical framework, and now love. I do not know if I am worthy of such gifts, but I promise you I will spend every night for the rest of your life proving myself deserving of them. The phrase struck Elena with sudden force. The rest of your life, not the rest of eternity. The reminder that she was mortal, that their time together was limited by her human span, hung heavy between them. Eventually, whether in years or decades, she would age and die while he continued on unchanged. This love they had confessed could not last forever, not unless... The thought formed before Elena could stop it, and once acknowledged, it would not be dismissed. There was one way their love could extend beyond her mortal span, one way they could have eternity together. But it would require her to become what he was, to embrace the darkness and accept the curse of vampirism. Dracula saw the thought forming in her eyes, and his expression hardened. No. Whatever you are thinking, Elena, the answer is no. I will not damn you to this existence. I will not make you into what I am, no matter how much I might wish for eternal companionship. You do not know what I was thinking, Elena protested, though they both knew she was lying. I know that look, Dracula said firmly. I have seen it before, in others who were drawn to the darkness. You are considering asking me to transform you, to make you into a vampire so we can be together forever. But I refuse. The curse that binds me will die with me. I will not pass it on to the woman I love, will not watch you descend into the same hell that has consumed me for centuries. Elena felt tears spring to her eyes, though she could not say whether they were from frustration or relief. Part of her had indeed been considering that possibility, imagining an eternity spent with this remarkable being she had come to love. But another part recognized the wisdom in his refusal, understood that such transformation would be a form of death in itself, the end of her humanity, and the beginning of an existence defined by hunger and darkness. Then we have only the time my mortality allows, she said quietly. A few decades at most, perhaps only years. How can that be enough? How can we accept the inevitability of separation when we have only just found each other? Dracula pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her in an embrace that was both comforting and achingly sad. It will have to be enough because the alternative is worse. I would rather have you for your natural span as a living, breathing human than for eternity as a cursed creature of darkness. Your mortality is part of what makes you precious, Elena. Your limited time makes every moment we share more valuable, not less. Elena buried her face against his chest, feeling no heartbeat there, but finding comfort in his presence nonetheless. I am afraid of losing you, afraid of wasting the time we have, afraid that what we feel will never be enough to overcome what you are. So am I, Dracula admitted. But fear is not a reason to abandon hope. It is simply a reminder that what we have is precious and fragile and worth protecting. We will make the most of whatever time we are given, Elena. We will love honestly and carefully, knowing that every night together is a gift rather than a guarantee. They stood there, holding each other as dawn approached, both of them acutely aware of how impossible and how inevitable their love had become. They were defying nature itself, mortal and immortal, prey and predator, light and darkness drawn together by forces neither fully understood. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and complicated by Dracula's nature and Elena's mortality. But as the first rays of sun touched the horizon, and Dracula reluctantly pulled away to seek shelter from the coming day, Elena felt a certainty settling over her. She loved him, he loved her, and they would navigate this impossible situation together for as long as fate allowed. There would be challenges and setbacks, moments when his control wavered and her courage failed. But they would face those moments, as they had faced every obstacle so far, with honesty, compassion, and absolute commitment to choosing light over darkness. "I must leave," Dracula said reluctantly, moving toward the door. "The sun will rise in minutes, and even with my improved strength I cannot risk its light." Elena walked with him, and at the threshold she caught his hand. "Before you go, promise me something. Anything. Promise me we will not waste the time we have. Promise me we will live fully in whatever way our circumstances allow, that we will not let fear of ending prevent us from truly beginning." Dracula cupped her face with both hands, his touch cold but infinitely tender. "I promise we will love as courageously as we are able, Elena. We will build something beautiful from these impossible circumstances. And when your time finally comes, whether in years or decades, I will carry the memory of our love through all the remaining centuries of my existence. You will be my redemption, my proof that even monsters can choose grace, my reason for maintaining the humanity we have worked so hard to reclaim." He kissed her forehead gently, a chaste touch that nonetheless sent warmth flooding through Elena's entire body. Then he was gone, fleeing the approaching dawn to whatever dark sanctuary sheltered him during daylight hours. Elena closed the door and moved to the window, watching as the sun rose over the mountains in a blaze of gold and crimson. A new day was beginning, but her thoughts were already on the coming night and the next opportunity to be with the impossible creature she loved. They had confessed their feelings, established ethical boundaries for his feeding, and acknowledged both the beauty and the tragedy of their situation. What came next would test them in ways neither could fully anticipate. But Elena was ready. She had chosen love over fear, hope over resignation, connection over safety. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with open eyes and an open heart, committed to helping Count Dracula complete his journey toward redemption, while savoring every precious moment they had together. The sun climbed higher, bringing with it the promise of another day and another night, another opportunity to prove that love could transcend even the boundary between life and death, that compassion could reach even the darkest soul, that redemption was possible even for those who had fallen furthest from grace. And in the darkness beneath the earth, wherever Dracula rested during the day, Elena hoped he was finding peace at last. Peace born not of forgetting his sins or denying his nature, but of accepting both while choosing to be something more. A vampire with conscience, a predator with mercy, a monster learning, slowly and painfully, to be a man again. Their story was far from over. In truth, it had only just begun. But Elena knew with absolute certainty that however it ended, whether in triumph or tragedy, it would be a story worth telling. A testament to the power of compassion, the possibility of change, and the enduring truth that love, in all its forms, was the most powerful force in existence, capable of bridging even the impossible distance between mortality and immortality, between damnation and redemption, between darkness and light. As she finally sought her own rest, Elena whispered a prayer of gratitude for the unexpected gift of this love, however complicated and dangerous it might be. She had invited a lonely stranger to dinner and discovered he was Count Dracula himself. And in the process, she had found something she thought lost forever: purpose, connection, and the transformative power of choosing compassion over fear. Whatever came next, she would face it knowing she had made the right choice. Love was always the right choice, even when it was impossible, especially when it was impossible. For it was in choosing love, despite all obstacles, that humanity revealed its greatest strength. the capacity to hope even in darkness, to connect even across impossible divides, to believe even when all reason suggested despair. And in that moment, as sleep finally claimed her, Elena understood that this was redemption, not just for Count Dracula, but for herself as well. They were saving each other, offering hope and healing where only loneliness and despair had existed before. Two wounded souls, finding wholeness in connection, proving that even the most broken beings could be made beautiful through the alchemy of love. The story would continue, the challenges would mount. But love once awakened could not be denied, and neither Count Dracula nor Elena Cartwright would ever be alone again. The end.